And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and we are continuing on with our series on cartography and a map of exactly where Christianity, the world religion of Christianity, is today, and a proposal, when we get that far, for what we are seeing as the future, not of Christianity, but of Christology. And we will distinguish between those two and what we think is the potential for a more interconnected, unified, global understanding of God identity. God identity being the key phrase. When I started thinking about this series, I thought about just starting with postmodern theology because that's really where the big change is going to happen. If you look on the spiral chart here, you see post-modernity, the green meme, if you will, is all the way up as the last stage of what spiral refers to as first tier. Now, the big jump, the evolutionary leap, is from all those first tier levels, which we're talking about and we have to review. That evolutionary leap takes us into an integral way of thinking, and that is different from all of the first tier worldviews and their lenses, be they beige, purple, red, blue, orange, and green lenses. Those lenses determined the way the content, the message, the narrative was interpreted. Was it a blue narrative? Is it an orange narrative? Is it a green narrative? That's the conflict that has brought such denominationalism into play today, and why our map has a myriad of different churches, different groups, all of them going their separate way when it comes to Sunday, all of them having different boundaries with regard to what is within their way of teaching. That gets back to concepts such as dogma, doctrine, creed. However, that is framed, there are boundaries that determine that which is Christian versus that which is not Christian. And that boundary word is big. And that's what we have to really discuss from the very beginning of the story. And that's why I decided I can't just start with postmodernity. I've got to go all the way back to archaic worldview, archaic Adam. And it's because that's where boundaries is introduced. And everybody listening to this knows that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And that's what's been happening over and over again. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So we're using spiral dynamics. Here it is. It is simply a model of historical evolution with regard to worldviews. It is not a religious model, a business model, a finance model, but it is used in all these different fields by people who are in consulting, and they find it extremely helpful to navigate the differences between cultures that exist on a global scale because the different nations and cultures across the world are on different pages. They're operating from different worldviews. And if you don't understand that you're going into a country that is very much ethnocentric, tribal in nature, and that is not only a tribal culture, but it is one that is constantly at war or in conflict with her surrounding nations, neighbors, then you are going to have a very difficult time knowing how to navigate that versus cultures that are very much blue, which we're going to explain, or orange or green, all of which we're getting to shortly. The point being that in order to understand how we got to where we are this very day, we have to go back and review all of the values that developed in each specific worldview, because all those values determined the way people understood identity. And we are specifically talking about the biblical narrative and God identity. So we began in the study with archaic Adam, the values of the archaic worldview. Primarily, it was all about survival. That was the primary value of that stage. And it is very much alive and well in every single human being on this planet. We are given an instinctual self. And that instinctual self has one job, and that's to keep me on the planet. Now, with regard to God identity, Adam wanted to be like God. The survival instinct desires its own power. It does not want dependence outside of the self. It does not want to depend on someone else for its survival. It wants everything needed to ensure its survival. Adam wanted to be like God. In actuality, Adam was already of God. But because he wanted to be like God by grasping the fruit, he therefore saw God as other. Death came the day he ate the fruit. In the day you eat of that fruit, you will surely die. And so he did, because he was separated. In fact, he saw God as other or separated. And this was the archaic experience of death, which is broken relationship with God. Death in the biblical narrative will, from time to time, of course, include biological death, but the primary enemy, when we get all the way out to Christology, the last enemy to be destroyed is death, and that death is not biological. That death is related to separation. Why is that a big deal? Because we've got a map that's based on separation. We use the word denomination. To denominate is to separate this from that. So the evolution of spiritual consciousness began as a separation paradigm, and it was a necessary step in the evolution of spiritual consciousness. Adam saw God identity as a thing to be grasped. In this sense, Adam was seeking God identity through self as source. His instinctual self desired, coveted to be like God. That's a self as source issue. That's a major concept in the story. Why? Because self as source is going to be the attempt to obtain God identity via doing. And we will see that there are two primary ways to understand God identity. One is doing, the other is being. And when we get out to the higher levels of the spiral, these worldviews that we're now entering into, which were not available in previous centuries, these worldviews we're now entering into are helping create within many, many different groups a heart for unity, a desire to find a way where we can have oneness, interconnectivity, and wholeness on our planet versus separation and conflict. So, Adam, in this archaic worldview, was exiled. He was exiled. And when you talk about exile, you're talking about the result, the consequence of separation thinking. Now, when we get on up to Israel and humanity becomes more complex than just the individual, and we are going to talk today about the collective in more detail. We introduced it last week, but we're going to talk about the collective, which is introduced by the tribal worldview. It becomes far more complex. And so separation becomes more complex. And we will see that in the complexity of Israel and the law, separation actually increases as you move into more and more of the human population. What we're talking about is the global human family. Is it ridiculous to think that there could be a path forward to global human unity through an understanding of universal God identity? How would that work? What would it look like? How would the map change? Because that is a radical proposal. How could these things all be true? So let's do one thing. Let me just go back here. I'm looking at my list of things that I've gone over with Archaic. Let me just briefly do a summary to make sure I've hit these points, because we're going to carry every single one of them all the way through in this series. Adam and Eve, in the beginning of the story, were given a commandment. Without a commandment, there were no boundaries as to what constituted God identity versus what violated or went against God identity. To disobey the commandment was to violate the boundary. This is the introduction of the concept of sin. And I do believe most everyone on planet Earth is familiar with the word sin. Sin, in the writings of Paul and the apostolic writers who were writing in the Greek language, is hamartia, which means to miss the mark, or we could say to violate the boundary. You can't disobey, you can't violate a boundary unless there's a commandment. So God issued a commandment. That commandment was violated through self as source action by Adam. The sin of Adam is the attempt to obtain God identity via self as source. The sin of Adam was the attempt to have God identity on the basis of doing. That is going to be a problem that is alive and well when we get all the way out to postmodern Christianity itself. So, the result of sin, or the violation of a commandment, was death. Death. In the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Death is the experience of separation from God. This death stands over against oneness with God. God then is going to be revealed through this whole process as all in all, and yet above all. And it was the transcendent nature of source, meaning God. It is the transcendent nature of source or God that defined unity. It had nothing to do with human doing. God as source and God alone, or spirit, defines unity. And therefore, Paul's language, for example, going further out into this story to see where we're headed, Paul's language is all about the unity of the Spirit. That's source. God identity was not accomplished by human self as source. Adam and Eve were already one with God. They were God breathed. They were a manifestation of God. Therefore, they were one with God. Breath, the breath of life. What does breath symbolize? Breath symbolizes the source of life. They were God breathed. but they were not conscious of the meaning of that. And in fact, the meaning of what it means to be God breathed, to be one with God, is in fact an evolutionary journey that we're going on in this series, and that will take us all the way out into the discussions of universal God identity. It was just beginning with them. They were in infancy. They represent human infancy, just learning, just as a little one, a tiny one, learns for the first time the commandment, no, no. And that commandment you don't issue when they're newborns. They are very much about surviving and doing things specifically that have to do with surviving and eating and all the other things that have to be attended to with that newborn. But there comes an age in that beginning stage when commandments, thou shalt not, or thou shalt, are introduced. So these are the foundational points that define God identity. It starts in the very beginning or genesis of the story. Commands were necessary to the evolution of spiritual consciousness with regard to God identity. Sin violates commands. Commands require boundary driven thinking. Death or separation is the consequence of sin. Sin comes through self as source. Sin is associated with doing. Now, all of this pertains to archaic Adam, right? Yes. Okay. When we go out to Paul, Paul is going to say that Jesus is the last Adam. Here is Paul explaining to his Gentile audience all these foundational points that I've just gone through. And the way he's doing it is by taking his Gentile audience all the way back to the beginning of the story, all the way back to Adam. And all that happened in Adam was related to separation, which is death. And that's why Paul would also say that all in Adam are dead. But if Jesus was the last Adam, then Jesus was going to put to death death itself, which is to say, Jesus was going to defeat separation. Jesus was going to move or transform that creation into a new creation whose identity would be based on life. When Adam and Eve were exiled from the garden, the word exile goes right along with that list of words that we've just gone through that have to do with separation. That's why exile was in the story with Adam and Eve. They were exiled from the garden. That's why it's in the story with Israel. Israel was exiled under Babylonian captivity, and the prophets bemoaned the fact that they were suffering exile because they had sinned against God. This is especially brought out by the prophet Daniel. We won't get into all that today because I'm painting a general picture of the foundational principles that have led us to our map today. So we're now into the tribal phase. And that also involves Genesis, because the other character in Genesis is Abraham, the story of Abraham. So we have two foundational characters that begin the story. One is Adam, one is Abraham. Abraham is related to the word promise. You will hear in the story the term the promises made to the fathers. Well, Abraham is referred to as Father Abraham because he is one of the foundational symbols of this story that begins as promise. It begins as promise. But when Jesus comes on the scene, he makes this statement: I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill. Ah, Jesus saw his role and function as a role and function of fulfillment. What does that mean? Wow. When we get out to Christology, it may seem simple to some or confusing to others what it means when Jesus says, I came to fulfill. In what way does Jesus fulfill all that came before him? And if he did fulfill it, what does that mean? What does it change? And that, of course, is at the crux of the story. So, again, we're looking at evolution. Evolution is a process. The promises that God made to Abraham were primarily twofold. Why is that important? Because the promise points to the concept of trajectory, a twofold promise that represents a trajectory. When you read people in the field of integral theory and integral consciousness, they will refer in their writings to this trajectory of human consciousness, not spiritual by any means. It can be, but many of these who write in terms of integral theory are just simply wanting to show that human consciousness has been a movement from ethnocentric thinking, ethnocentric worldviews, to world centric thinking, world centric worldviews. That's why we say at present our tagline is a global, world centric conversation for a new earth. And new earth is something we will absolutely talk about because we want to see in what way the evolution of universal God identity and the awareness of it can bring us into a completely new way of seeing, which will then provide for us a completely new space of being. Now, while Adam operated through self as source, Abraham is famous because he operated through faith. Faith points away from the self to that which is source. In the biblical narrative, source is presented as God. And that word source, I use quite frequently when I'm talking to people that are not from the biblical narrative. This is especially true, it seems to me, in people within science who are absolutely moving into the spiritual realm with their understanding of our universe, in that quantum physics has led many in science to see that there's something behind our universe, something from which our universe has been manifested. And rather than use the word God, God has a lot of baggage for people. God may have baggage for you. In a matter of fact, most people who have problems with God, in my opinion, actually have problems with the way the concept of God has been interpreted. So, the word source, you'll hear me use the word source instead of God because I'm in conversations with people who are not necessarily coming from the biblical narrative. So, the faith of Abraham actually points to a world centric outcome of unity. But the Abrahamic story begins with an ethnocentric viewpoint or a one nation promise. The first promise to Abraham was, Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, singular. Now, that's how it began. Let's look at how it beautifully folds right into what the spiral says. Abraham had a son, Isaac. For those of you who have been raised in Christianity and know the story, Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob was Abraham's grandson. Jacob's name was eventually changed to Israel, And so Jacob had 12 sons, meaning that Israel, as Jacob, had 12 sons that became the 12 tribes. So therefore, they were called the 12 tribes of Israel because Jacob was known as Israel at that time. 12 tribes is how the collective in the story of the evolution of spiritual consciousness with regard to universal God identity began. It began in tribal purple that you see in the spiral because it literally was tribal. It was the very beginning of the trajectory. Tribes in the beginning were made up purely on the basis of genealogy. This will change as human populations became far more complex, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Abraham's promise, I will make of you a great nation, refers to the fact that from Abraham would come a grandson whose name would be Israel. His 12 sons would be the 12 tribes of Israel, and that would be the great nation, singular. That great nation had a specific call from God, but that specific call from God was not that that nation would always remain specific and particularistically God identity alone. It was simply going to be the first and initial steps of understanding God identity, but it wasn't going to stay in that ethnocentric realm. The second promise was a promise regarding all nations. All nations. The promise was through you, Abraham, I will bless all nations of the earth. And here we get into the first clue about the concept of universal God identity. At the very beginning of the story, the word ALL is introduced. All nations. This is related to the universality of God's work. It was a promise from the beginning. Not that God could eventually be all in some, as we've stated time and time again in these different podcasts, but rather that God could be understood as all in all. And again, if you go back to Paul's New Jerusalem in Galatians 4, it is presented in juxtaposition to the first Jerusalem. Galatians 4 is a beautiful example of this universal idea. The first Jerusalem was ethnocentric, made up of 12 tribes, specific to those 12 tribes. But the second Jerusalem was called a New Jerusalem, and it was an all nations collective. By the time we get to the revelation of John, John will say in his vision, he saw all, there's that word, all nations walk in the light of a New Jerusalem. So the New Jerusalem differs from the first Jerusalem because it is a movement from ethnocentric to world centric. This was not a denigration of the first Jerusalem or the people that understood their God identity in these first stages. I would have done the very same thing. It was the initial understanding of growing up or evolving in awareness of God identity. And so it was ethnocentric, and Israel saw her relationship with God very much as the definition of it. But when you move into the New Jerusalem, you're taking everyone that was within the original Jerusalem and you are explaining how there is some transformative work going on. Here we get into a word transform. What does it apply to? It's going to apply to Christology. And the whole point of Christology is to make aware the people that began with ethnocentric thinking were being transformed into a wider, more expansive, interconnected, holistic, world centric understanding of God identity. Paul says to the Romans it was actually in chapter 1, if you want to look it up, Romans 1:17, Paul made this statement, for the righteousness of God is being revealed from faith to faith. What does that mean? The righteousness of God is being revealed from faith to faith. For Paul, the trajectory is from Abraham to Christ, meaning from the faith of Abraham to the faith of Christ. So when the narrative is talking about the promises made to the fathers, it starts with Father Abraham. The faith of Abraham was faith in God's promise. The faith of Christ was the basis for the fulfillment of that promise. Therefore, Jesus knew that his whole role and function was about bringing things to fulfillment, and that fulfillment was going to be absolutely necessary to reveal movement from an ethnocentric tribal based Jerusalem into a world centric global New Jerusalem. And that's going to be the role and function of Christology. We'll get to it. We'll talk about it in a lot more detail. Christ, then, the concept of Christ is that of reconciling the world. God was in Christ, reconciling the world back to God. That was then the whole outcome of the story, reconciling the world or all nations back to God. It's an all nations story. Peter phrased it a little differently in the book of Acts, chapter 3. He's talking about God bringing about the restoration of all things, ALL, restoration of all things, not some things. God is all in all, not all in some, and on we go. This is the trajectory of an all in all God that is taught by the apostolic writers throughout the story. But when we look at the map and we go back to the map, there's problems with this all in all God message on a number of levels. So I want to just bring up here that we don't forget where are we headed. We're headed toward that map. What's the problem with the map? The problem with the map is separation. Separation's a dirty word in the narrative. Separation, division, denomination, those are not part of the process of universal God identity that represents the elements which stand in opposition to it. Once again, let me say that the nature of source determines the nature of offspring. God is the source of all, not some. So, tribal's not the end of the human collective regarding identity, it's the beginning. Denominations are a way of separating. And is it possible that the interpretation of Christology from the first century forward simply carried forth a tribal understanding of Christ so that denominations represent their own tribal identities today, separated from each other, often in conflict, often in argument, and that Christ as a message is a message of separation? Even in the fact of world religion, Christianity differentiates itself through all other religions, and this requires boundaries. You cannot show the difference between world religions without the boundaries that define them. History matters. History matters. And that's why we're doing this study, and that's why we're going into this history. Now, we're going to move along. The next time I get into these things, I'm going to move on to the warrior phase. And so when I do that, we will really be getting close to the final elements that I have to go over before I really can get us into present day. So we're looking at the past, and we are going to be looking at the future as we move along here. Thanks for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next time.